When we speak of character, we are not speaking of the mask a person wears in the marketplace of society, nor of the polished phrases that emerge when one is observed, judged, or desired. Character does not live where consciousness performs, it lives where consciousness breaks down. I have spent a lifetime watching human beings, not in their declarations, but in their fractures, not in what they say they believe, but in what betrays them when belief no longer holds the reins. And if you ask me, as many have over the years, how one may see the true nature of another without becoming entangled in illusion, I will answer you with something deceptively simple. Though it may unsettle you, the longer you carry it within yourself, you must watch two things, and you must watch them patiently, without haste, without moral vanity, and without the desire to be proven right. The first is how a person reacts when their self-image is threatened. The second is how they behave when they hold power over someone who cannot resist them. Everything else is ornament. You may feel a quiet resistance arise in you as I say this, because the conscious mind prefers complexity where clarity feels dangerous. Yet the psyche is economical. It reveals itself through pressure, not explanation. Character is not revealed in comfort. It is revealed at the moment when the ego's construction is no longer sufficient to protect the individual from inner contradiction. Let us begin with the first movement, though I will not name it as such again, for names harden what must remain fluid. Imagine a person who has spent years cultivating an image of being virtuous, intelligent, generous, or spiritually awake. This image is not false in the crude sense. It is simply incomplete. The persona, as I have called it, is a necessary adaptation to the world. Without it, one could not function socially. The tragedy begins only when the person mistakes this mask for the totality of the self. Then any challenge to the image is experienced not as information, but as annihilation. Watch carefully what happens in such moments. A simple disagreement, a mild correction, or even a neutral boundary can provoke disproportionate reactions, sudden moral outrage, icy withdrawal, contempt disguised as superiority, or an urgent need to explain oneself into innocence. These are not random behaviors. They are eruptions from the shadow, the rejected part of the psyche that has been denied admission into consciousness. When the persona is cracked, the shadow does not politely introduce itself. It bursts through the fracture. You will notice that people often speak of being triggered, as though the outer world were the cause of their inner violence. This is an error of projection. What is triggered is not created by the event, it is revealed by it. The intensity of the reaction tells you everything you need to know about what has been repressed. A person who can tolerate a wound to their self-image without collapse has already made some acquaintance with their shadow. A person who cannot will unconsciously defend the ego at any cost, including the distortion of reality itself. In my clinical work, I observed again and again that the most dangerous individuals were not those who knew they were capable of darkness, but those who believed themselves incapable of it. They were often kind, articulate, and morally convinced until the moment their righteousness was questioned. Then something ancient and feral would surface, often accompanied by a complete lack of self-reflection. Such people do not experience their aggression as aggression. They experience it as justice, If you wish to know whether someone is psychologically mature, do not listen to how they speak about their values. Watch how they respond when they are wrong, when they are misunderstood, or when their virtue is not acknowledged. Do they become curious, or do they become punitive? Do they reflect, or do they retaliate? The soul always reveals itself when it is cornered. This is why dreams are so instructive. In dreams, the ego loosens its grip, and the unconscious stages its own theater. A person who dreams of being chased, humiliated, or exposed is often carrying a fragile persona that fears disintegration. A person who dreams of descending into darkness, meeting strange figures, or confronting animals may be further along the path of individuation, where the psyche no longer insists on purity but seeks wholeness. If you watch someone long enough, their waking life will resemble their dreams. The same symbols repeat, though in subtler forms. Now let us turn our gaze to the second movement, which is perhaps even more revealing, because it requires no confrontation at all. Observe what a person does when they hold power and believe they will not be held accountable. Power does not corrupt. As the saying goes, power reveals. It removes the need for pretense. It allows the unconscious to act without disguise. This power need not be grand or political. It may be as small as social status, intellectual authority, emotional leverage, or the advantage of being needed. Watch how someone treats those who cannot offer them anything in return. Watch how they speak to those who depend on them. Watch how their tone changes when they believe they are above consequence. Here you will see whether the person has integrated their shadow or merely displaced it downward. Those who have not faced their own darkness often require an inferior other onto whom it can be projected. They may be gentle with equals and cruel with subordinates, generous in public and dismissive in private. This split is not accidental. It is the psyche's attempt to maintain a self-image by sacrificing another. You may notice a particular coldness in such interactions, a lack of genuine presence. The other person becomes an object, a function, or a mirror rather than a soul. This is not always dramatic. Often it appears as indifference, but indifference, psychologically speaking, is a form of violence. It denies the reality of the other. In contrast, a person who has encountered their own shadow does not require domination to feel whole. Their authority, if they possess it, is quieter, less performative. They do not need to remind others of their position, because it is not the foundation of their identity. They can afford to be humane precisely because they are not fleeing from their own inhuman impulses. They have seen them, and therefore are not possessed by them. There is an archetypal image that appears again and again in mythology, the king who descends into the underworld before he can rule wisely. Without this descent, power becomes inflation, the ego swells, believing itself divine, and the inevitable fall becomes catastrophic. On a smaller scale, this myth plays out in everyday life. Those who have not descended will unconsciously use power to avoid the descent. Those who have descended no longer fear what power might expose. You may ask, at this point, whether this knowledge should be used as a weapon, a way to judge or categorize others. I caution you against this temptation. The moment you begin to use psychological insight to elevate yourself, you have stepped into the very trap you believe you are observing. The shadow is infinitely clever. It will gladly dress itself in insight and call it wisdom. The true task is not to diagnose others, but to remain awake within yourself while observing. When you feel contempt arise as you watch someone reveal their character, ask yourself what part of you is relieved to see darkness outside rather than within. When you feel admiration for someone's restraint or humility, ask yourself whether you are idealizing them to avoid your own work. The psyche does not allow shortcuts. In the end, these two movements are not tools for control, but invitations to depth. They remind us that character is not what we intend, but what we are when intention collapses. It is what remains when the lights go out and the soul is left alone with itself. And if you listen closely, not only to others but to your own reactions, you will begin to sense a deeper order at work, one that does not divide the world into good and evil, but into conscious and unconscious, integrated and split, whole and fragmenting. And as this awareness deepens, you may find that what you are truly watching is not them at all, but the slow, relentless unfolding of the human psyche itself as it moves, often unwillingly, toward the truth it cannot escape. And yet, as you remain with this watching, something subtler begins to occur within you, something that is not immediately visible but unmistakably felt, like a pressure behind the sternum or a tightening in the throat. You begin to realize that observing another's character is never a one-way act. The psyche does not permit neutrality. The moment you truly see, you are implicated. The image you form of the other constellates an image within yourself, and this inner response is often more revealing than the outer behavior you are witnessing. There are moments when a person's reaction to a threatened self-image awakens in you a familiar discomfort. Perhaps you recognize the same defensiveness, the same sudden moral certainty, the same hunger to be right rather than to be real. This recognition is rarely welcomed. The ego recoils from it. It would prefer to remain an observer, untouched and superior, but the unconscious does not honor such arrangements. It insists on participation. This is why genuine psychological insight is so often accompanied by humility, or failing that, by exhaustion. When the psyche encounters truth too quickly, it becomes overwhelmed. Therefore, it reveals itself in layers. Through repetition, you may watch the same person react again and again, and each time you think you understand them, a new nuance appears. This is not because they are inconsistent, but because character is not a fixed object. It is a living pattern, shaped by complexes that activate under specific conditions. What you are really witnessing is not who they are, but how their psyche organizes itself around threat, desire, and power. A complex, as I have described it, is an emotionally charged cluster of ideas, image, and memories that behave like a partial personality. When a complex is activated, the ego is temporarily displaced. The person is not pretending, they are possessed. This possession is especially visible when the self-image is endangered. Suddenly, the adult becomes a child. The moralist becomes a tyrant. The lover becomes a judge. These shifts are not failures of character. They are revelations of what has not yet been integrated. Integration, however, is not the same as control. Many confuse psychological maturity with emotional regulation alone, but a person can regulate their behavior perfectly while remaining profoundly unconscious. True integration means that the ego has entered into dialogue with the shadow, not imprisoned it. The shadow does not disappear. It becomes humanized. And when this occurs, reactions lose their compulsive quality. One may still feel anger, shame, or envy, but these effects no longer hijack the personality. They inform it. If you observe someone who can admit inner conflict without self-destruction, you are witnessing a psyche that has begun to tolerate wholeness. Such a person may still suffer, but their suffering is no longer sterile. It produces meaning rather than repetition. This is why their responses to challenge often carry a strange gravity. They do not rush to defend or to attack. There is a pause, a gap in which something deeper seems to listen before speaking. That pause is not indecision. It is the presence of the unconscious as a collaborator rather than an enemy. Now consider again the matter of power, but this time not as an external position, but as an inner condition. Every human relationship contains an asymmetry at some point. One person needs more, knows less, loves more intensely, or fears loss more deeply. This asymmetry creates an opportunity for domination or for responsibility. The difference between the two lies entirely in character. When someone encounters another's vulnerability, their response reveals the ethical structure of their psyche. Do they experience the other's dependence as an invitation to care or as permission to exploit? Often the difference is invisible at first, because exploitation does not always appear as cruelty. It can appear as charm, guidance, or even protection. The unconscious is capable of great sophistication in disguising its hunger. Watch, therefore, not only what a person does, but how they feel while doing it. Do they become animated by the other's weakness, subtly energized by the imbalance, or do they remain grounded, perhaps even burdened, by the knowledge that power places a demand upon the soul? Those who have not examined their shadow often feel secretly invigorated by having the upper hand. They may deny this even to themselves, but the body rarely lies. There is a tightening, a gleam, a quickening that betrays the inner dynamic. In dreams, this dynamic often appears as scenes of control or captivity. One dreams of being a ruler, a teacher, a rescuer, or conversely, of being trapped, diminished, or watched. These images are not literal predictions, they are symbolic representations of how the psyche relates to power and helplessness. A person who repeatedly dreams of rescuing others may be compensating for an unacknowledged desire to dominate. A person who dreams of being powerless may be unconsciously submitting to relationships that replicate an unresolved complex. The unconscious is moral, but not in the way the ego imagines. It does not reward good intentions. It seeks balance. If power is abused outwardly, the psyche will compensate inwardly through anxiety, emptiness, or self-sabotage. If vulnerability is denied inwardly, the psyche will seek it outwardly through humiliating circumstances. Character, therefore, is not only visible in behavior, but in fate. The patterns that repeat in a person's life are often the clearest commentary on their inner structure. As you continue to observe others through this lens, you may feel a growing solitude. This is unavoidable. To see clearly is to lose certain illusions, and illusions are often what bind people together. When you no longer participate fully in collective denial, you may find yourself less easily impressed, less easily seduced by confidence or charisma. This does not make you superior. It makes you more responsible for your own projections. You will also notice that truly integrated individuals are rare, and this realization can be disheartening. But rarity does not imply impossibility. The psyche moves slowly across generations as well as individuals. Each person who undertakes the work of integration alters not only their own destiny, but the psychic atmosphere around them. They become less reactive, less contagious in their unconsciousness. This, too, is a form of power, though it does not announce itself. There is a danger here that must be named, even if naming it feels uncomfortable. The danger is that insight becomes a shield against intimacy. Seeing the shadow in others can tempt you to withdraw, to remain an observer rather than a participant. But life does not ask us to become spectators of the human condition. It asks us to engage consciously, knowing that engagement will wound us, confuse us, and sometimes undo us. Character is not revealed only in how we judge others, but in how we allow ourselves to be changed by what we see. If you watch someone reveal their character and you feel the urge to harden, to protect yourself through detachment alone, pause, ask whether this detachment is wisdom or fear wearing the mask of wisdom. The psyche grows through relationship, not avoidance. Boundaries are necessary, but they are not the same as walls. A boundary preserves the self, a wall isolates it. As this awareness deepens, the two movements I have spoken of begin to merge: how a person reacts to threat and how they wield power are no longer separate observations. They are expressions of the same inner configuration. The one who cannot tolerate injury to the ego will often misuse power to avoid it. The one who cannot bear power responsibly will often collapse when challenged. These are not moral failings in the simplistic sense. They are symptoms of a psyche that has not yet learned to hold tension. The capacity to hold tension without premature resolution is, perhaps, the most reliable indicator of character. It is the ability to remain present between opposites without fleeing into righteousness, dominance, or despair. This capacity cannot be taught through instruction alone. It is forged through encounter, through loss, through the slow, often painful recognition that the self one believed oneself to be is only a fragment of a larger, more ambiguous whole. And if you listen carefully, beneath all these observations, there is a quieter invitation, almost a whisper, suggesting that the true purpose of seeing another's character is not to protect yourself from them, but to awaken yourself to the immense, unfinished task of becoming whole, a task that does not end in certainty, but continues moment by moment, wherever the psyche is brave enough to remain conscious. And as this task of remaining conscious continues, you may begin to sense a deeper unease. one that does not belong to any single encounter, but arises from the cumulative weight of what you are now able to perceive. When illusions fall away, the world does not become lighter. It becomes heavier, more real, more demanding. You see that much of what passes for morality is merely fear in ceremonial clothing, and much of what passes for strength is only unexamined fragility, standing upright. This realization can induce a quiet grief, for it dissolves the comforting fantasy that maturity is common or that goodness is effortless. At this stage, many people attempt to retreat into systems, ideologies, or spiritual doctrines that promise purity. They cling to teachings that divide the psyche neatly into light and dark, saved and fallen, awakened and asleep. Such divisions offer relief, but they do so at the cost of truth. The psyche does not develop through exclusion, it develops through confrontation. Any path that promises transcendence without dissent is, psychologically speaking, an evasion. You will notice that individuals who are most invested in appearing enlightened are often those least able to tolerate ambiguity. Their reactions to disagreement are swift and moralized. They experience difference not as an opportunity for dialogue but as contamination. This is not because they are malicious, but because their identity depends on remaining uncontaminated. The shadow, having been banished, lurks just beyond awareness, ready to return in distorted form. Here again, character reveals itself not in proclamations but in thresholds. How does a person behave when certainty dissolves? When there is no clear right answer, no authority to lean upon, no group to hide within, does anxiety turn into curiosity, or does it harden into dogma? The psyche that can endure uncertainty without violence has already learned something essential about itself. This endurance is intimately connected to the capacity for symbol. The symbolic attitude allows the ego to relate to unconscious material without literalizing it. Dreams, myths, and images are not instructions, they are communications. A person who can think symbolically does not rush to act out inner tensions in the outer world. They can hold the image, contemplate it, and allow it to transform them slowly. This capacity is a cornerstone of character, though it is rarely recognized as such. When symbolic capacity is weak, the psyche seeks discharge. Inner conflict becomes outer conflict. Unacknowledged aggression seeks a target. Unintegrated desire seeks permission. This is why periods of social upheaval are often accompanied by a collapse of symbolic language. Everything becomes literal, urgent, and polarized. The collective shadow is activated, and individuals are swept along by forces they do not recognize as their own. In such times, watching character becomes both easier and more dangerous. Easier because stress strips away pretense. Dangerous because the temptation to align with the right side can eclipse the work of consciousness. The psyche prefers belonging to truth. To resist this pull requires an inner anchor, something deeper than opinion. It requires a relationship to the self, that central archetype of order and meaning which transcends the ego without annihilating it. The self does not speak in slogans, it speaks in contradictions, in paradoxes that frustrate the conscious mind. It demands patience, sacrifice, and a willingness to be misunderstood. Individuals who are guided even unconsciously, by this inner center often appears slower, less reactive, sometimes even withdrawn, yet when they act, their actions carry a peculiar inevitability, as though something larger were moving through them. Observe how such individuals relate to conflict. They do not seek it, but they do not flee from it either. When confronted, they do not immediately defend the ego's territory. There is a listening that precedes response, an orientation toward meaning rather than victory. This does not make them passive. On the contrary, their boundaries can be firm, even uncompromising, but the firmness arises from clarity, not from fear. Contrast this with those whose identity is organized around being right. Their boundaries are brittle. They shatter or become weapons. Any challenge is experienced as an attack, and every attack must be repelled or countered. Power, in Jung, hence, becomes a means of self-preservation rather than service. Even kindness can become strategic, a way of securing loyalty or avoiding abandonment. You may begin to see how early these patterns form. In childhood, the psyche adapts to survive. If love is conditional, the child learns to perform. If power is arbitrary, the child learns to appease or dominate. These adaptations are not chosen, they are necessities. But what saves the child can imprison the adult. Character development, therefore, is not the acquisition of virtues, but the gradual relinquishment of outdated defenses. This relinquishment is rarely graceful. It often coincides with periods of depression, disorientation, or loss of meaning. The ego experiences these states as failures. The psyche experiences them as thresholds. Something is dying, but it is not the self. It is the image of the self that can no longer contain the fullness of what one has become. Those who resist this death cling more tightly to control. Those who endure it emerge with a quieter authority. If you watch carefully, you will notice that people who misuse power are often terrified of inner collapse. They need the external world to remain predictable, hierarchical, and affirming because their inner world is not. Conversely, those who can tolerate inner chaos are less invested in dominating the outer world. They have already faced a disorder that no social position could shield them from. At this point, the two movements you are watching no longer appear as behaviors to be analyzed, but as symptoms of a deeper orientation toward the unconscious. Character is revealed in the direction a person moves when faced with disintegration. Do they turn inward, risking humility and self-confrontation, or do they turn outward, seeking control, validation, or enemies? This movement is often unconscious, but it is remarkably consistent. You may also notice a change in how you yourself are seen. As your awareness deepens, others may project onto you qualities you do not recognize. Some will see judgment where there is only clarity. Others will see threat where there is only boundary. This is inevitable. When you no longer collude with illusion, you become a mirror, and mirrors are rarely loved. This, too, is part of the cost of seeing, yet there is a strange compensation. As superficial bonds loosen, a different kind of connection becomes possible. You may find yourself drawn to fewer people, but with greater depth. Conversations slow down, Silence becomes more tolerable. There is less need to impress or to agree. In such spaces, character does not have to be inferred. It is felt almost somatically, as a resonance or a dissonance in the body. The body, in fact, often knows before the mind. Tightness, fatigue, sudden agitation, or inexplicable calm can all be signals of unconscious perception. When words and actions diverge, the body registers the truth. Learning to listen to these signals without immediately acting on them is another dimension of maturity. Impulsivity is not authenticity. It is often the voice of a complex seeking expression. As you integrate these perceptions, the act of watching becomes less effortful. You no longer need to test or provoke to see what is hidden. Life provides enough pressure on its own. What remains is a steady attentiveness, a willingness to let patterns reveal themselves over time. This patience is not indifference. It is respect for the psyche's tempo. And somewhere within this patience, a realization quietly takes root that the ultimate measure of character is not how one appears under observation, but how one lives when no narrative is being constructed, when there is no audience, no enemy, no role to perform, only the ongoing, unglamorous encounter with one's own contradictions, which, when born consciously, become not a source of shame, but the raw material of a deeper, more durable humanity. And now, as we move toward the place where all these threads converge, you may feel a certain quiet tightening of meaning, as though the psyche itself were drawing the circle closed. This is not an ending in the ordinary sense. It is a return, but a return at a deeper level, where what was once observed outside is recognized as an inner law. For the two movements you have been watching in others eventually turn their gaze upon you. And when they do, there is no longer the comfort of distance. You will discover that there are moments in your own life when your self-image is threatened in ways you cannot control. Perhaps you are misunderstood and cannot correct the misunderstanding. Perhaps you fail publicly and are not given the chance to explain. Perhaps you are seen clearly in a way that feels intolerable. In such moments, the psyche does not ask who you want to be. It reveals who you are able to be. This is not a moral judgment. It is a diagnostic one. It shows you the limits of your integration. If you can remain present without immediately reconstructing the persona, something extraordinary may occur. You may feel exposed, smaller, less certain, and yet strangely more real. The ego loosens its grip, and beneath it there is not nothing, but a deeper ground, one that does not require constant defense. This ground is not confident in the way society defines confidence. It is resilient. It can survive contradiction. It can endure not knowing. Similarly, there will be moments when life hands you power unexpectedly. Someone will depend on you emotionally, intellectually, or practically. You will notice how easily subtle superiority can arise, how tempting it is to enjoy being needed, admired, or feared. These impulses do not make you corrupt, they make you human. The question is not whether they arise, but whether you recognize them before they act through you. To recognize them is to interrupt possession. It is to say inwardly, without dramatization, without self-hatred, that something ancient and instinctual has entered the room. When this recognition occurs, choice becomes possible. Without it, behavior is automatic, justified by reason after the fact. This capacity for recognition is the ethical core of character. It is not perfection, it is consciousness. You may notice that the more conscious you become in these moments, the less dramatic your life appears from the outside. There are fewer triumphs and fewer collapses, less need to prove, to conquer, to perform. This can feel like a loss, especially in a culture intoxicated by intensity. But psychologically, it is a gain. The energy once spent maintaining illusions becomes available for meaning. Meaning, however, does not announce itself. It grows slowly, like roots extending into darkness. It is felt more often than understood. You sense it in the way decisions begin to align without force, in the way certain paths close without bitterness, in the way you can say no without cruelty and yes without self-betrayal. These are not heroic achievements. They are signs of inner order. At this point, the question of other people's character changes its tone. You no longer watch in order to protect yourself alone, nor to categorize, nor to feel superior. You watch because you understand the cost of unconsciousness, both in yourself and in others. This understanding brings with it a peculiar compassion, one that does not excuse behavior but sees its origin. Compassion of this kind does not weaken boundaries, it clarifies them. You begin to accept that some people cannot meet you where you stand, not because you are above them, but because you are oriented toward a different center. This acceptance is not resignation, it is realism. To expect consciousness where there is none is as futile as expecting vision from a closed eye. The tragedy is not that people differ, but that they are often punished for being what they have not yet become. As you live with this realism, something in you relaxes. The urgency to expose, to correct, to awaken others diminishes. You recognize that individuation is not contagious in the simple sense. It cannot be imposed. It can only be modeled. Your way of being becomes the teaching. Though few will name it as such, some will feel threatened by it. Others will feel strangely at ease without knowing why. This is the paradoxical fruit of character integration. It does not make you impressive. It makes you trustworthy, first to yourself, and then, quietly, to others. Trustworthy not because you are always kind or always strong, but because your actions are less split from your awareness. What you do arises more often from necessity than from compulsion. In the deepest sense, the two movements you have been watching are not rules but mirrors. They show you where the ego is fragile and where the shadow seeks compensation. They reveal the places where consciousness has not yet entered. And once you have seen these places in yourself, your perception of others is forever altered. Judgment gives way to discernment. Reaction gives way to response. You come to understand that character is not a possession but a process. It is not what you have, but what you are becoming through repeated encounters with your own limits. Each time you choose awareness over defense, responsibility over domination, presence over performance, something in the psyche settles into a more stable configuration. This stability is not rigidity, it is coherence. And so, if you wish to see someone's true character, You will still watch these two movements, but now with a different heart. You will watch not to expose, but to understand, not to protect your ego, but to protect your soul from unconscious entanglement. And in doing so, you will discover that the most demanding character to witness is your own, unfolding slowly, imperfectly, through time, asking not for admiration, but for the courage to remain conscious where it would be easier to look away.